It was just another routine night for Officer Daniel Reeves, a veteran police officer who had seen it all, or so he thought. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by, and he was about to head home after his shift. But then, something caught his eye. A sleek black sports car rolled by, driving a bit too fast for the calm evening. Reeves, always on alert, decided to pull the car over. It was just a regular traffic stop, or so he assumed. The car came to a halt at the side of the road, and as Reeves approached, he noticed the driver. The man sitting behind the wheel was calm, his face unreadable, wearing a neatly pressed suit. Reeves didn't think much of it at first, just another well-dressed person on the road. But as the officer got closer, something about the situation didn't sit right with him. The driver seemed too composed, almost too calm. "Good evening, sir," Reeves said, trying to sound polite. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The driver didn't immediately respond. Instead, he calmly reached for his glove compartment and retrieved his documents. "Here's my license and registration, officer," the man said in a steady voice. Reeves glanced down at the documents, noting the name on the license, General Marcus L. Parker. For a moment, the name didn't register in his mind. It was just a name, right? The man in front of him didn't look like someone special. However, as he glanced at the name again, something inside him shifted. The name sounded familiar, but the officer didn't immediately know why. He ignored his instinct to double-check and proceeded with the stop as if it were any other. But there was something about the man's calm demeanor that rubbed Reeves the wrong way. "Step out of the car," Officer Reeves commanded. The words left his mouth before he could fully think about them. The driver raised an eyebrow, but complied. He stepped out of the car without argument, his face still calm and collected. There was no sign of panic or frustration. He stood tall and composed, but there was a calmness about him that sent a shiver down Reeves' spine. Something didn't feel right. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his tone polite but firm. His eyes locked with Reeves, and for a second, the officer hesitated. Was this really just a traffic stop? Why did it feel like there was more going on? But instead of reflecting on it, Reeves pushed forward. "You're being detained," he said, his voice cold. There was no reason for this level of aggression, but something in Reeves took over. He had made up his mind. The man before him, even though calm and polite, felt somehow out of place. "Hands behind your back." The driver, now visibly confused, asked, "Why are you doing this?" His voice never raised, never panicked, just steady and unwavering. But his question wasn't enough to stop Officer Reeves from making a rash decision. As he grabbed the man's arm to put him in cuffs, he noticed the eyes of bystanders staring at them. A few cars had stopped, and people were already pulling out their phones, starting to record. Reeves didn't think much of it. This was just another arrest. But in the back of his mind, he wondered if he was doing the right thing. Was this really just a traffic stop? As Officer Reeves started to twist the man's arm behind his back, a sinking feeling began to settle in his stomach. He wasn't sure why, but something about this situation felt off. The man remained unnervingly calm, not fighting back, not raising his voice. Instead, he stood there, almost as if he had been through this before. Reeves glanced at the license again, seeing the name, General Marcus L. Parker, and his gut tightened. Still, the officer couldn't put it all together. "Do you know who I am?" the man asked quietly, his voice calm but with a hint of authority that caused Reeves to pause. Reeves didn't respond right away. He was too focused on the situation at hand. The general calmness of the man only added to the confusion, but he was already in the process of putting him in cuffs. "You're under arrest," Reeves repeated firmly, trying to control his thoughts. He was so focused on his actions that he failed to realize how dangerous the situation was becoming. As he tightened the handcuffs on Marcus's wrists, he noticed a few cars slowing down. More people were stopping to watch, some taking out their phones. There was a crowd starting to form, And that's when the officer felt a prickle of doubt. Was this really necessary? Was he doing the right thing? But instead of slowing down, Reeves continued. He wasn't about to back out now. "I'm a U.S. Army general," Marcus said, his voice still steady, but now with an edge of seriousness. "You're making a mistake." For a moment, Reeves froze. The name finally clicked in his mind. General Marcus L. Parker. It wasn't just any name. It was the name of a highly respected leader in the U.S. Army. This man was a 4-star general, someone with years of service and honor. But the realization came too late. The damage had already been done. One of the passing cars stopped, and another officer got out. He was younger and looked around at the scene with wide eyes. His gaze shifted from the handcuffed man to Officer Reeves, and his face went pale. "Wait, General Parker," he asked, his voice shaky as he stepped forward. Reeves looked at his partner, whose face was slowly turning from shock to horror. "You didn't," the officer started to say, but the words caught in his throat as he realized the full gravity of the situation. "General, I didn't know," Reeves muttered, his voice now tinged with nervousness. "I thought." Marcus interrupted him, not with anger, but with a quiet, measured tone. "It doesn't matter what you thought, officer. It's what you've done that counts." The air between them grew thick with tension. The young officer, still clearly in shock, fumbled for his radio, calling for backup. There was no turning back now. The situation was out of their control. The bystanders, who had been filming, were now murmuring among themselves. Some seemed to realize who Marcus was. Others simply stood still, staring. Reeves stood there, unsure of what to do next. He had made a mistake, a huge one. But what could he do now? He couldn't just undo what had been done. All he could do was stand there, waiting for his partner to radio in, hoping that someone would come and fix the mess he had created. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, but for Officer Reeves, the real consequences were already beginning to set in. The regret was growing inside him like a knot in his stomach. He knew something had gone terribly wrong. But at this point, there was no way to change the course of events. The damage had been done, and all he could do was face the aftermath. As the young officer fumbled with his radio, calling for backup, the reality of the situation began to hit hard. Officer Reeves could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. His hands were still shaking from the rush of adrenaline, but now, that same adrenaline turned to regret. He had made a rash decision, and the consequences were becoming clearer by the second. The man he had just handcuffed, General Marcus L. Parker, was no ordinary person. He was a man of honor, a leader who had served the country with distinction for decades. The young officer, still standing there frozen, glanced at Reeves in disbelief. "You really didn't know?" he asked, his voice full of shock. Reeves, unable to meet his partner's gaze, nodded slowly. I didn't recognize him at first." His voice was soft, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. The crowd that had gathered was growing, and the tension in the air was thick. Some people were quietly whispering to each other, while others continued to record the scene with their phones. Reeves could hear the sound of the camera shutters clicking, the unmistakable noise of an online storm beginning to form. In an instant, this moment was going to be everywhere. The news, social media, the evening broadcasts. There was no going back from this. Marcus stood there, hands still cuffed, his posture straight and dignified. Despite the pain of the situation, he didn't seem to show any outward frustration. His eyes, however, spoke volumes. They were calm, but there was a sense of quiet anger behind them, a mix of disbelief and regret. He had served his country with pride and earned respect from all corners of the world. And now, he was standing in the middle of a street, wrongly detained by an officer who didn't recognize him. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice still even but carrying the weight of his words. "You've made a mistake, officer, but that doesn't change who I am. I'm not just anyone." Reeves didn't respond right away. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? "I'm sorry" seemed hollow now, and nothing he said could undo the damage. He had crossed a line, and all he could do now was wait for his partner to make the call to higher-ups. Moments later, the sirens grew louder as backup arrived. Reeves could hear the sound of multiple cars approaching, and he knew that the situation was quickly getting out of his control. More officers stepped out, their eyes quickly scanning the scene. Some recognized General Parker immediately, while others looked around in confusion. One of the new officers, a sergeant, walked up to Marcus and immediately spoke with respect. "General, I apologize for this," the officer said, carefully removing the handcuffs. "We'll make sure this gets sorted out." Marcus didn't flinch as the cuffs were removed. He didn't say a word. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression calm, but with a clear message in his eyes. He was not the one who needed to apologize here. Reeves stood to the side, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him. The other officers, the onlookers, and the cameras. This moment was no longer about him. It was about what he had done, the mistakes he had made, and the consequences that would follow. The young officer who had first recognized Marcus stood nearby, his face pale. He looked over at Reeves with a mixture of disbelief and disappointment. "This is bad," he muttered under his breath. Reeves knew it was bad. Worse than he could have ever imagined. The scene was now fully in motion. The police department would have to act fast, and the media would waste no time reporting what had happened. But for Officer Reeves, the damage was already done. His career, his reputation, and the trust of the community were on the line. He couldn't undo the past, and he had no idea what would come next. As the situation started to settle, Officer Reeves stood off to the side, watching as General Marcus L. Parker was carefully escorted to one of the police cars. The air was thick with tension, and the sounds of sirens, voices, and whispers filled the street. More officers arrived, but their eyes were now focused on Reeves, some with judgment, others with concern. The rookie officer who had first recognized Marcus kept glancing back at him, but neither said a word. The entire scene had shifted in a matter of minutes. Marcus didn't seem angry. He didn't lash out or raise his voice, despite being wrongly detained. His calmness was unnerving to everyone around him. The officers who had arrived were trying to process the situation quickly. One of them, a senior officer, took charge, giving directions to his team. They began taking statements, collecting the footage from bystanders' phones, and preparing for the inevitable investigation. Reeves stood alone in the crowd, feeling the weight of his mistakes settle deep in his chest. He had heard of General Marcus Parker before. He was a legendary figure in the Army, highly respected, and a symbol of leadership. To have mistaken such a man for an ordinary citizen, to have physically detained him, was beyond careless. The consequences were already spiraling, and Reeves knew that no amount of explanation would make it right. The senior officer approached Reeves after a few minutes. "What happened here?" the officer asked, his tone firm but not entirely accusatory. "You pulled over General Parker." Reeves nodded, his head hanging low. "I didn't recognize him at first," he said quietly. "I thought he was just another driver." His voice trailed off as he realized how weak his excuse sounded. The senior officer didn't respond right away. He just stared at Reeves for a moment, his face grim. Finally, he spoke again, more softly this time. "You know what kind of trouble this can cause, right?" Reeves nodded again, feeling his stomach twist. He had made a huge mistake. He had acted too quickly, without thinking, without truly understanding who he was dealing with. And now, the police department would have to deal with the fallout. There was no excuse for what had happened. Meanwhile, Marcus had been speaking with one of the higher-ranking officers, explaining his side of the story. His calmness never wavered, and although the situation was completely unfair, he didn't let his emotions control him. He knew that, in time, the truth would come out, but for now, he was focused on handling the situation with dignity. He wasn't about to let this careless mistake ruin his composure. As the investigation into the incident began, the news spread quickly. Phones started buzzing, news stations were calling, and social media exploded with the story. The video taken by a bystander, showing the moment Marcus was detained and handcuffed, quickly went viral. People were shocked. Some couldn't believe it had happened, while others were simply disgusted that an officer could treat someone like Marcus with such disrespect. Many demanded answers, but the truth was clear. Officer Reeves had made a monumental error. Back at the station, a flurry of activity began as the police chief was notified of the incident. The department had already started to prepare a statement for the media, and Internal Affairs was notified about the situation. It was only a matter of time before they would have to address the matter publicly. Reeves had hoped, even for a moment, that perhaps things might just blow over. But deep down, he knew that the truth had already been exposed. There was no avoiding what was coming next. His actions were under scrutiny, and he had no one to blame but himself. The news stories began to unfold, and as they did, one thing became painfully clear. The department, the city, and the public would be watching this situation closely. Officer Reeves had set in motion a chain of events that could very well change his life forever. The aftermath of the incident unfolded quickly, and within hours, the story had spread across news outlets and social media platforms. The video of Officer Reeves detaining General Marcus L. Parker was everywhere. People from all over the country watched in disbelief as a highly respected Army general was treated with such disregard. Some viewers were shocked by what they saw, while others expressed anger at how an officer had mishandled the situation. As the video circulated, public outcry grew louder. News stations were calling for interviews, and social media posts began flooding in, each one demanding answers. The hashtag Justice for General Parker trended for hours, with people sharing their opinions on what had just happened. It didn't matter if they knew the full story or not. What mattered was that a respected figure, a man who had served his country for years, had been treated unfairly. In the police station, Officer Reeves could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, texts from his family, friends, and even former colleagues. They were all asking the same thing. What happened? He hadn't been able to answer them. Not yet. He didn't have the words. How could he explain what had happened when he still couldn't understand it himself? The department's leadership was in full crisis mode. The police chief had called an emergency meeting. Everyone was scrambling to figure out how to handle the situation. They knew they needed to act fast. The city's reputation was on the line, and it wasn't just a matter of bad press. It was a matter of public trust. Reeves sat in a small office, his face pale and his hands trembling. His mind replayed the events of the night over and over, but no matter how many times he went through it, he couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He had made a critical mistake. It wasn't just about the fact that he had detained the general. It was about the way he had handled the entire situation. Too quickly, too forcefully, without fully thinking things through. And now, that mistake was becoming a national story. The news was relentless. Stories about the incident appeared in newspapers across the country. Some outlets focused on the question of racial profiling, while others questioned whether the police department had failed to properly train their officers. The broader conversation turned into a debate about systemic issues within law enforcement, and the incident became a flashpoint for discussions on how police treat citizens, especially black individuals. This wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. It was about something much bigger. As for General Marcus Parker, he continued to handle the situation with dignity and composure. He had given his statement to the press, explaining what had happened and calling for an investigation into the actions of Officer Reeves. He expressed his belief in the importance of justice and accountability, but he made it clear that his focus was on moving forward. He didn't want this incident to define him or his legacy. He had served his country honorably, and he wasn't going to let one careless mistake from a police officer tarnish his reputation. Meanwhile, The police department found itself in a difficult position. They had to acknowledge the mistake, but they also had to be careful about how they responded. If they mishandled the situation, it could make things worse. The pressure was mounting from every direction. The public demanded transparency and accountability, and they weren't going to settle for anything less. Back at the station, Officer Reeves remained isolated. He knew that the department would have to make some difficult decisions soon. Would he be placed on leave? Would he face disciplinary action or even termination? There were no easy answers. His future was uncertain, and all he could do now was wait and hope that he could somehow make amends for the mistake that had already cost him so much. As the days passed, Officer Reeves found himself living in a state of constant tension. The media coverage of the incident was only growing, and the calls for justice seemed endless. The news continued to focus on the way General Marcus L. Parker had been treated during the traffic stop. People wanted answers, and the public was demanding accountability from the police department. Reeves knew that this wasn't just a local problem. It had become a national issue. His phone was constantly buzzing, filled with messages from reporters, friends, and family. Some messages were filled with anger and disappointment, while others simply asked if he was okay. But there was no way to explain how he felt. How could he possibly put into words the overwhelming sense of regret that consumed him every moment? He had made a mistake, one that couldn't be undone. And now it was all over the news. His actions had cost him not just his career, but his peace of mind as well. The police department was under intense pressure to handle the situation. Internal investigations were launched, and the leadership was working overtime to figure out what went wrong. They had to address the public, assure them that the mistake would be corrected, and that officers would be held accountable. But despite their efforts, the damage had already been done. Officer Reeves had made a critical error in judgment, and now it was up to the department to determine how to proceed. Meanwhile, General Marcus L. Parker continued to handle the situation with grace. He had made his statement to the press and had called for a full investigation, but he also expressed that he didn't want to see this moment define the police force or the city as a whole. He didn't want his experience to overshadow the work of good, honorable officers who served their communities with integrity. But even with his level-headedness, the situation was far from over. Reeves was put on administrative leave while the department conducted its internal investigation. His future within the police force was uncertain. Would he be allowed to return to work, or would he be fired for his actions? The department had to weigh the severity of the mistake against his years of service. But as the investigation went on, one thing became clear. The public and the media had already made their judgments. Through it all, Reeves couldn't help but reflect on how his life had changed in just a few short days. A routine traffic stop had turned into a career-altering mistake. He could still remember the moment he had approached Marcus's car, thinking it would be just another traffic violation. But in that instant, everything had changed. Now his name was plastered all over the news, linked forever to the mishandling of a respected general. Reeves had always taken pride in his work as a police officer. He had joined the force to make a difference, to protect and serve. But now, as he sat in his small apartment, he questioned everything he had worked for. He couldn't erase the events of that night from his mind. The face of General Parker, the calm, dignified man who had been wrongfully detained, haunted him. What had he been thinking in that moment? Why hadn't he recognized the situation for what it truly was? As the days wore on, Reeves realized that he could no longer avoid the truth. He had made a mistake, and now he had to live with the consequences. But even as he came to terms with his actions, he still held out hope that, in time, he could make things right. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew that he would have to find a way to redeem himself, to prove that he was more than just that one mistake. The pressure was building, and the department was about to announce their decision. The public was watching, and the weight of it all pressed down on Reeves. He couldn't escape the reality of what he had done, and no matter how hard he tried, There was no way to turn back the clock. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of Officer Reeves' mistake continued to hang over him. The internal investigation into the incident was ongoing, but the public's opinion had already been formed. Every day, he woke up to new headlines, new news stories, and new social media posts. People were still talking about the day he had detained General Marcus L. Parker. The questions had only grown louder. How could an officer make such a careless error? Why wasn't he able to recognize someone so important? Reeves tried to keep his head down, staying away from the public eye as much as possible. He spent most of his time alone, replaying every detail of that night in his mind. He couldn't escape the haunting image of Marcus, calm, collected, and wrongfully detained. It felt like a weight on his chest that he couldn't shake. He had hurt a man who had done nothing wrong, a man who had served his country with honor. And he had done it all because of his own rushed decisions. The department had promised a full investigation, and everyone was waiting for the outcome. Internal Affairs had interviewed Reeves and reviewed all the body cam footage, along with the video from the bystanders who had witnessed the entire scene. The truth was clear to everyone. Officer Reeves had acted too hastily. He hadn't taken the time to assess the situation or recognize who he was dealing with. And now, the department had to decide what to do next. Reeves spent his days trying to figure out how to fix the mess he had made. He couldn't change the past, but he was determined to make amends. He knew that his actions had consequences, and he wasn't expecting a simple solution. It was clear that he had to own up to his mistake and face whatever came next. But even with that realization, it didn't make the situation any easier to handle. Meanwhile, General Marcus L. Parker had remained silent on the matter after his initial statement. He had made it clear that he wasn't looking for revenge or to tarnish the reputation of the police force. Instead, he had urged for the situation to be used as a learning opportunity. He believed in accountability, but he also believed in the importance of moving forward. In his statement, he spoke about his hope for police reform, a call for better training and more awareness within law enforcement. His words were calm, measured, and thoughtful, and they resonated with many people across the country. But even with his level-headed approach, the incident remained a turning point in the discussion about race and policing. Reeves knew that no matter how much he tried to make things right, the story had already become bigger than he was. It wasn't just about his mistake. It was about how people saw him, how they saw the police force, and how they saw the larger issues of racial injustice. As an officer, he had always believed in fairness and justice. But now, he realized that his actions had failed to live up to those values. The department had yet to announce their final decision on his future. Would he be reinstated, or would he face disciplinary action? Every officer at the station was watching, waiting for the outcome. Reeves had become a symbol of the flawed system, and it was up to the department to decide whether he would be allowed to continue serving or whether his career would be over. As the investigation drew to a close, the pressure continued to mount. Reeves couldn't help but think about how things had changed. His life, his career, and his future all rested on the outcome of this one decision. He had learned the hard way that actions have consequences, and he was about to face the truth of what that meant. But even as he braced himself for the department's decision, one thing was clear. No matter the outcome, this was a turning point in his life. The lesson had been learned, and it had been a painful one. There was no turning back, and all he could do now was face whatever came next with the same determination that had led him to become an officer in the first place. The day finally came when the police department made their decision. The investigation into the incident involving Officer Reeves and General Marcus L. Parker had come to a close. Tensions had been running high for weeks with everyone. Officers, the public, the media, waiting to hear what would happen next. The decision would not only determine Officer Reeves' future, but also reflect how seriously the department took the issue. Inside the department's conference room, the police chief and senior officers gathered for a final meeting. The room was tense, filled with a mixture of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about accountability, fairness, and the reputation of the police force. The decision they made today would set a precedent for how the department would handle such situations in the future. The police chief stood before the group, his expression serious. He addressed the room, stating that the department had thoroughly reviewed all the evidence, including bodycam footage, witness statements, and the video captured by bystanders. They had carefully considered the severity of Officer Reeves' actions and the impact they had on both General Parker and the community. It was clear that the mistake had been significant, but they also acknowledged that it was a result of poor judgment, not malice or intention. After much discussion, the police chief made the announcement. Officer Reeves would be placed on a probationary period and undergo additional training. This training would focus on improving judgment in high-pressure situations, as well as understanding the importance of identifying individuals in sensitive circumstances. The department had also decided to implement broader reforms, focusing on better training for all officers to ensure they were prepared to handle any situation with the utmost professionalism and respect. While Reeves wouldn't face immediate termination, he understood that this second chance came with a heavy responsibility. His actions had already caused significant damage to his career, and his road to redemption would not be easy. The public's opinion, particularly in the wake of such a widely discussed incident, would take time to heal. He would have to prove that he was truly worthy of this second chance, that he had learned from his mistake, and was committed to becoming a better officer. In the days following the decision, the department issued a statement to the public, explaining their actions and outlining the reforms that would be put into place. They emphasized their commitment to justice, accountability, and ensuring that similar mistakes would not happen in the future. They also addressed the importance of community trust, acknowledging that incidents like this had lasting effects on public perception of law enforcement. Officer Reeves was left to reflect on the outcome. He had been given an opportunity to make things right, but he knew that it would take more than just training to rebuild his reputation. It would take time, humility, and a renewed commitment to upholding the values that he had once joined the force to represent. As for General Marcus L. Parker, he had moved on from the incident. His focus remained on his work and his commitment to supporting others. But he continued to advocate for police reform. He believed that this moment, despite the wrong that had been done to him, could be an opportunity for change within the system. The incident would not define either of their futures. For Officer Reeves, it was the beginning of a long journey, one where he would have to prove himself worthy of the trust that had been lost. And for General Parker, it was just another chapter in a lifetime of service and dedication. In the end, both men had learned valuable lessons from the event. Officer Reeves had been reminded that actions have consequences, but he also learned that redemption was possible. General Parker, on the other hand, was reminded that leadership wasn't just about being right. It was about doing the right thing, even when the situation was difficult.